All right, so get ready, because today we're diving into some really intriguing stuff. We're going to be looking at a sermon, and get this, it claims to reveal the, true Jesus, the one supposedly hidden, from mainstream Christianity.
Yeah, it is pretty intriguing, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the sermon we're looking at is by a guy named David C. Pack, and he's a minister in the Restored Church of God.
Okay, the Restored Church of God. And just for our listeners who might not be familiar, can you give us a little bit of background on that? What is the Restored Church of God?
Yeah, so the Restored Church of God is actually an offshoot of Armstrongism.
Okay.
Which itself is already, considered a pretty unorthodox branch of Christianity.
Right. So we're already starting off in some pretty, fringe territory here.
We are. We're going deep.
Yeah.
And to make things even more interesting, Pack's sermon really jumps right into this idea that there's a counterfeit Jesus.
Wait, a counterfeit Jesus. Okay, I'm hooked already. What does he mean by that?
Well, he doesn't really hold back. One of the most striking things he says is he argues against, the traditional Christian belief that, the saved go to heaven.
Okay.
And he points to, a specific verse where Jesus actually says, no man has ascended into heaven.
Okay. But isn't that kind of taking things out of context? I mean,
Yeah.
most Christian denominations interpret heaven as being, the ultimate destination, even if, the timing and specifics are debated.
Yeah, exactly. And this is where we start to see this pattern, right?
Okay.
In Pack's teachings,
Yeah.
where it seems like he's taking very specific verses to support his interpretations.
Okay.
Which a lot of times, actually contradicts centuries of Christian doctrine.
It's like he's almost building this whole other, belief system, but he's attributing it to Jesus.
Yeah.
So, okay, if mainstream Christianity has it all wrong about, going to heaven and things like that, then what does Pack say? What does this true Jesus actually teach? What's the deal there?
Right. So another big thing is that he emphasizes the law. So he claims that this false Jesus, did away with the law, but the true Jesus was all about, keeping the commandments.
Okay.
And he even lists 5 of the 10 commandments.
Oh, wow.
To really hammer home the point.
Okay, so we're getting into the whole law versus grace debate here.
Exactly, right.
Where traditional Christianity sees Christ's sacrifice as fulfilling the law, not necessarily abolishing it.
Exactly, yeah. And this is where understanding the historical and theological context is super important.
Yeah.
Because Pack's interpretation really seems to be aligning more with this strict literal adherence to the Old Testament law.
Okay.
Which, isn't how most Christians understand the new covenant, that's established through Christ.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. So
Yeah.
What else does he say about this false Jesus?
Well, then he goes on to tackle Sunday worship. So he claims that mainstream Christianity is wrong to observe Sunday as the Lord's Day, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he says the true Christ actually upheld the Sabbath. And he quotes, Jesus saying, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath."
So he's advocating for Sabbath observance over Sunday worship.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah, that's definitely not a perspective you hear every day.
Not at all, especially in mainstream Christianity. And it really highlights how Pack's teachings kind of deviate from this established Christian tradition, which really shifted to Sunday worship to commemorate Christ's resurrection. And that's been central to Christian denominations for centuries.
Yeah. Okay, so, right off the bat, we're seeing some pretty significant differences between Pack's true Jesus and the Jesus presented by what we would call mainstream Christianity. Are there any other examples that really stand out, where his interpretation kind of clashes with the traditional views?
Oh yeah, and they get even more, maybe a little more surprising.
Okay.
So for example, he really challenges the traditional understanding of the immortal soul and eternal punishment in hell. So he argues that, the mainstream view is wrong and the wicked are simply going to be destroyed.
Okay.
They're not going to be eternally punished.
Wow. Okay, that's a pretty bold statement.
It is.
Because, the concept of hell and eternal punishment, it's really ingrained in traditional Christian theology, right? It's woven throughout the New Testament.
Exactly.
So to say that, that's definitely not within the mainstream of Christian thought at all.
It's not. And it really, again, it shows how he's consistently rejecting or reinterpreting these core tenets of Christian faith.
Yeah.
in favor of his own kind of unique doctrine.
So it seems like he's really constructing this, like very specific and I would say somewhat controversial version of Jesus.
Yeah.
But like what's fascinating to me is like why? Like why is he doing this? What's the like a motivation behind reinterpreting these like such fundamental aspects of, Christian belief?
That's a really good question. And it kind of leads us to dig even deeper into Pack's teachings.
Okay.
And what their potential impact is, right?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, we've established that Pack's version of Jesus is pretty different from the one that, most Christians are familiar with. So let's go a step further with this. Let's try to understand, like, what makes his teachings so unique.
And more importantly, how they differ from what we would consider, like, traditional Christian orthodoxy.
Exactly, because it's not just about contrasting interpretations. It's about understanding how those interpretations fit.
Right.
Or in this case, don't fit within the broader context of established Christian belief.
Right. So to understand Pack's true Jesus, we need to delve into like the specifics of his teachings and compare that to, traditional Christianity.
Yeah, let's get into the nitty-gritty here. I'm ready.
Let's do it.
Let's dive in.
So one of the first things you'll notice is how much he emphasizes legalism.
Okay.
He constantly stresses the importance of like strictly adhering to the Old Testament law, even going so far as to say that salvation depends on it.
That's very different. I mean, because most Christian denominations really emphasize grace and faith as the foundation of salvation. And they see Christ's sacrifice as fulfilling the law,
Right.
Not necessarily that we have to like perfectly follow it in every detail.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really important to remember here that, Pack's group is considered like outside of mainstream Christianity.
Okay.
They're really operating more like, some would say like a non-Christian cult within the already kind of unorthodox world of Armstrongism.
Wait, a cult. Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Like what makes Pack's group fall into that category, and how does that relate to his like claims about the true Jesus?
Well, there's a few things going on here. So first of all, Pack actually has a history of making prophecies that they failed to come true.
Okay, well, predicting the future is, always tricky business.
Right.
But in, traditional Christianity, like a pattern of failed prophecies, that's definitely a red flag.
It is. And it raises these like really serious concerns about, the legitimacy of his claims. Like where are these teachings actually coming from?
Right, because if the prophecies aren't, coming from God, then where are they coming from? And how can followers be sure that they're being led by the truth?
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated when you consider that there are claims that Pack's group exhibits, cult-like behavior.
Okay, so, what are we talking about here specifically?
Well, things like isolating members from their families and friends.
Oh, wow.
Controlling their finances.
Okay.
Controlling their personal lives.
Okay.
Demanding, like, absolute obedience to Pack's authority.
So it's not just about having different beliefs. It's about the potential for manipulation and harm within the group itself. And according to, traditional Christianity, groups like Pack's are, they're considered to be on a dangerous path, right?
They are.
Like far removed from the teachings of the real Jesus.
Yeah, their beliefs and practices deviate so much from Orthodox Christianity. They're seen as leading people away from the truth, not toward it.
Wow. This is a lot to unpack. So we've got his unique interpretation of Jesus, this emphasis on legalism, failed prophecies, and these, accusations of cult-like behavior within the group. It's a really complex web of beliefs and practices here.
Yeah.
And it raises a lot of questions.
It does. And to, really understand Pack's true Jesus, I think we need to carefully examine all these elements and really consider how they might be influencing his followers.
So, okay, where do we go from here? What's next?
Well, I think we need to move beyond just identifying the discrepancies, right?
Yeah, and really try and understand what the underlying motivations and implications of his teachings are.
Sounds good to me. I'm ready to dive deeper.
Let's do it. So, we talked about how Pack's teachings really differ from traditional Christianity.
Right.
But what I find so interesting is how he constructs this image of the true Jesus.
Yeah.
It's definitely not the image that most people are used to.
Yeah, from what I've heard, Pack's Jesus sounds a bit more intense, shall we say.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. He presents Jesus as this like rugged carpenter,
Okay.
a far cry from like the more, I don't know, ethereal figure you often see in art and stuff.
Yeah, right.
And he even goes so far as to describe Jesus as having like short hair and condemning, popular holidays.
What, like where holidays?
Like Christmas and Easter.
Condemning Christmas and Easter. I mean, those are like pretty central to Christian tradition. I've never heard anyone argue against those before. Yeah, it's definitely a point of contention. These holidays have been like central to Christian tradition for centuries. I mean, there's celebrations of Christ's birth and resurrection, right? But Pack views them as like pagan.
Okay.
And insists that like true followers should reject them.
It's almost like he's trying to like strip away any elements of like cultural influence or tradition and just get back to like this like ultra pure, form of Christianity.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And it ties back to his emphasis on, strict adherence to the Old Testament law. It's about rejecting anything that he sees as compromise.
But wouldn't that make it pretty hard to like actually live in the world?
Right.
I mean, how do you navigate daily life if you're constantly rejecting like cultural norms and traditions?
Right. And that's a really valid question. And it brings us to like, why people might actually find his teachings appealing.
Okay, so why would someone find this version of Jesus, appealing? I mean, it seems pretty like strict and demanding.
It is. It is. But for some people, I think that rigidity can actually offer like a sense of certainty.
Okay.
Right. In a world that feels, increasingly chaotic, there's like a very clear-cut right and wrong, a defined path to follow, no ambiguity.
So it's like a refuge from the complexities of modern life.
In a way, yes. Yeah, it provides this sense of order.
Okay.
And control, a clear set of rules to live by. And for people who are, struggling with doubt or uncertainty, that can be really, really appealing.
Yeah, I can see how that would be, attractive to some people. But it also makes me think back to those accusations of like cult-like behavior within Pack's group, right? Because if there's this like emphasis on control and obedience, it seems like there's like a real potential for those things to be like taken too far.
Yeah, that's a very valid concern. And I think it's really important to remember that while Pack's teachings might offer a sense of certainty,
right,
they also come with a cost.
Right, like the isolation from, family and friends, the control over your finances, your personal decisions.
Yeah.
I mean, those things can have like a really devastating impact on people's lives.
Absolutely. And it's why it's so important to be like really aware of the potential dangers of groups like Pack's.
Right.
Even if their initial message seems, kind of appealing on the surface.
Right. Okay, so we've got this like fascinating and honestly kind of troubling picture emerging here, right? Yeah. We've got Pack's teachings that really diverge from traditional Christianity. We've got this unique image of Jesus, this emphasis on strict adherence to the law, rejection of cultural influences. And then we've got these serious concerns about his failed prophecies and the potential for manipulation within the group.
Exactly, yeah.
So it's a lot to think about.
It is. And all of that, I think, raises some important questions about like the nature of belief, the power of interpretation, and I think the responsibility that we all have to like really critically examine religious teachings, especially those that claim to have, exclusive access to the truth.
Okay, but how do we even begin to navigate those questions?
Right.
It's such a like a complex and sensitive topic.
It is, but I think it's a conversation that we really need to have because understanding groups like Pack's, it's not just about some theological debate.
Right.
It's about recognizing the potential for harm, right? And protecting ourselves and others from potentially like destructive ideologies.
So where do we go from here? Like, what are some like key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think one of the most crucial things is just to emphasize the importance of critical thinking and discernment, right? Especially when it comes to religious beliefs.
And don't just take someone's word for it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Even if they seem, charismatic or convincing, like do your own research. Compare what you're hearing to, established doctrine, historical context.
Right, exactly. And don't be afraid to like ask questions,
Yeah.
even if they seem, challenging or uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, true faith should be able to withstand scrutiny.
Yeah, it's not about, like, blind obedience. It's about, seeking understanding
Right.
and truth.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that there is a potential for harm when groups become like too insular, too focused on their own specific interpretation to the point where they reject anything that doesn't, perfectly align with their doctrines.
It's like they kind of build a wall around themselves.
Yeah.
And anyone who, like, questions their beliefs is seen as like an enemy or a threat.
Exactly. Yeah. And that kind of isolation can create this environment where critical thinking is discouraged.
Right.
Dissent is silenced, and individuals become really vulnerable to manipulation.
So it's not just about theological differences. It's about, the potential for real world harm.
Exactly. And that's why, this conversation is so important, because understanding the dynamics of groups like PACs can help us to recognize those warning signs,
Right.
and protect ourselves and others from potentially like destructive influences.
Okay, so we've talked about, like, the dangers here.
Mm-hmm.
But what about, like, the appeal of PAC's teachings, right? I
You're
mean,
right.
people are drawn to them for a reason.
They are, yeah. And I think that speaks to like a much deeper human need, the need for belonging, the need for certainty,
Mm-hmm.
and a sense of purpose in a world that often feels, chaotic and meaningless.
So it's not just about being told what to believe. It's about, like, finding a community, a place where you feel like you belong.
Right.
And your life has meaning.
Exactly, yeah. And that's why it's so important to like address those underlying needs in healthy ways,
Okay.
right? Because when those needs go unmet, I think people become much more susceptible to these potentially, harmful ideologies.
It's like those ideologies kind of offer a quick fix,
Right.
a sense of belonging and purpose that's,
Yeah.
like, easy to grasp onto, even if it comes at a cost.
Exactly. And that cost can be, incredibly high
Yeah.
for individuals and for society as a whole.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into David C. Pack's teachings, what's, like, the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I think the most important takeaway is to just, be critical, be discerning,
Yeah.
and be informed. Don't be afraid to like ask questions and challenge beliefs, even your own. True faith is about seeking understanding,
Yeah.
not blind obedience.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to transition to our final thoughts for the listener. I'm really curious to hear what you've come up with.
Okay, so wow, we've explored some really like heavy stuff today.
Yeah.
How Pack's teachings differ from traditional Christianity, the potential dangers of his group, and like why these kinds of ideologies, can be appealing to people in the first place. It's a lot to process.
It is. It is. It's a lot to take in, but I think it's really important, to examine these issues because, they touch on something that's really fundamental about human nature.
You mean like our need to believe, our need to find meaning, our need to feel like we belong?
Exactly. Yeah. We
Yeah.
all have this, like, innate desire to understand, the world around us, to make sense of our lives, to connect with something larger than ourselves.
Yeah. And for some people, I mean, maybe Pack's teachings, despite how unorthodox they are and the potential for harm, maybe they do provide those things, at least, on the surface. It's possible, yeah. He offers this very, like, clear-cut worldview, a sense of certainty in a world that often feels, pretty chaotic and unpredictable. And, within his group, there's this very strong sense of community, like you belong to something special.
But that sense of belonging can come at a pretty steep price.
Yeah. It definitely can. And when a group becomes too insular, too focused on its own specific interpretation to the point where it rejects all others, I mean, it can lead to isolation, to control, to, even abuse in some cases.
And that's where I think, like, the need for critical thinking is just so vital.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. We need to be able to like step back and examine our beliefs, even the ones that really resonate with us, and ask ourselves like, where's the evidence? Does this align with what I know to be true? What are the potential consequences, of following these teachings?
It's about taking responsibility for our own, like, spiritual journeys,
Mm-hmm.
not just, like, blindly accepting what we're told.
Exactly, yeah. And it's about, I think, recognizing the difference between genuine faith and blind obedience. True faith should empower us to think critically, to question, to seek understanding. It shouldn't like shut down our minds or isolate us from the world.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into the teachings of David CPAC, what's like the one question you want our listener to kind of ponder as they go about their day?
That's a good question. I think the most important question to ask is, what makes someone susceptible to potentially harmful doctrines?
Wow. Yeah, that's a really powerful question. It goes beyond just analyzing PAC's specific teachings, right? And it gets to the heart of like why people are drawn to these kinds of ideologies in the first place.
Exactly, yeah. And I think the answer lies in understanding those, deeper human needs that we've been talking about. The need for belonging, for meaning, for a sense of certainty in a world that often feels very uncertain.
So it's not just about like debunking false teachings.
Right.
It's about like addressing those underlying needs,
Yeah.
in healthy and constructive ways.
Exactly. It's about creating communities that foster critical thinking, compassion and a genuine search for truth rather than, blind obedience or isolation.
It's about empowering individuals to think for themselves and to make informed choices about their beliefs and their lives.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, a journey that each of us has to take for ourselves.
Absolutely. So to our listener, as you continue to, explore the world of faith and belief, just remember, keep those minds open, keep those questions coming, and, above all, be kind to yourselves and to each other. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.